Iran's President Ebrahim Raisi died in a helicopter crash on the 19th of May. This was a huge surprise to the world and will have a lot of significant political impacts that I'll be discussing today. Now, I should start stressing that the Iranian government is not going to collapse. There are a lot of people in the West who are gloating about this and saying this is the end of Iran. That's outrageous. It's ridiculous. In reality, the Iranian government immediately appointed Raisi's first vice president as the interim president, and there will likely be presidential elections within the next few months to determine who the next president will be. So there are many capable politicians and leaders in Iran. They will continue to govern. There is stability. However, this is very significant because Raisi was widely considered to be the next likely supreme leader of Iran. For those who don't know, Iran really has two top officials. There is the president, who oversees political affairs, but there is also the leader of the revolution, the supreme leader. And this goes back to the Iranian Revolution that took place in 1979, in which the people of Iran overthrew the monarchy, the Shah, who is a US-backed dictator who ruled the country for decades with an iron fist. And after this US-backed dictator was overthrown, the new revolutionary government in Iran created the Islamic Republic, and the supreme leader is the leader of the revolution. So today, the current supreme leader in Iran is Ali Khamenei. He's the second ever supreme leader, and he's 85 years old. So quite soon, he is likely to pick a successor to replace him. And many people thought that Raisi was going to be appointed the next supreme leader, the next leader of the revolution. After all, the current leader of the revolution, Khamenei, he had been Iran's president in the 1980s. And then when the first leader of the revolution died, Khamenei was appointed as the next supreme leader. So given that, Raisi's death is, of course, a major complication, and there could be some significant changes in Iran. However, the Iranian government has emphasized that there will be continuity, in particular in its foreign policy. Its foreign policy remains unchanged. And this is something that we have seen in Iran in the past few decades. As the presidents have changed, the foreign policy has seen elements of continuity. We saw this going back to the 2000s with Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, and then after that with Hassan Rouhani, and that brings us to today with Ebrahim Raisi, who just passed away. Today I want to talk about Iran's foreign policy, how it has evolved in recent years, and how increasingly Iran has been integrating more and more with the global South. This is something that Ebrahim Raisi had strongly supported. Under Raisi, Iran joined the BRICS. It also joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Iran called for de-dollarization, working with countries around the world to try to use local currencies to challenge the hegemony of the US dollar. Also under Raisi, Iran adopted a so-called Look East policy, emphasizing improving its relations with other countries in Asia, and Iran deepened its relations in particular with China and Russia. Raisi also prioritized Iran strengthening its relations with Latin America and with Africa, and emphasized the importance of fighting against colonialism and Western imperialism. Now, these policies were not exactly new. Previous presidents had also pursued a similar foreign policy, but in the past few years, since Raisi became president in 2021, Tehran really prioritized its integration with the global South. And in general, this has been an important point since the Iranian Revolution in 1979, which, yes, Iran's government is religious, it has an Islamic orientation, but also it has always been nationalist. And what we can really see is that the Iranian Revolution is a kind of third world nationalist revolution, a global South revolution, and Iran has maintained close ties with other revolutionary governments in the global South. And in the past few years, with the relative decline of Western hegemony, we've seen that the Iranian government has really emphasized this anti-colonial discourse and emphasized its relations with other revolutionary governments in the global South. And of course, one of the central points of Iran's foreign policy going back to the revolution has always been staunch support for the Palestinian struggle against Israeli colonialism. And we saw this in December when Iran's President Raisi organized an international conference to support Palestine. Iran has always supported the right of the Palestinian people to armed resistance against Israeli colonialism, which is written into international law and has been reaffirmed by numerous UN General Assembly resolutions. And in this conference in December, President Raisi called for more countries around the world to support Palestine, to lift the illegal Israeli blockade of Gaza, to ensure more humanitarian aid. And Raisi accused the United States of being, quote, the first and biggest violator of democracy in the world. And he denounced the, quote, global hegemonic system for violating human rights in Gaza. And this has been something that Iran has always emphasized, that Israeli colonialism is part of a larger Western imperialist structure led by the United States. And since the revolution, Iran's government has maintained that Israel is the little Satan, while the United States, the US empire, is the great Satan. And this is why Iran has often allied with many other global South nationalist and leftist and socialist movements who are united in a common struggle against US-led imperialism and the Western colonial powers who dominated so much of the world in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And still today, the global South is fighting against Western neocolonialism and US-led imperialism. And this was a very important message that was often emphasized by President Raisi. And back in 2023, when Iran was invited to join both BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, Raisi emphasized that Iran's membership in these organizations help it counter US unilateralism and hegemony. In a speech, Raisi said, quote, I have repeatedly said that we will not wait for the Western states to smile and will not tie our country's economy and people's lives to their will. He rejected speculation that only through rapprochement with the West, rather than joining with the global South, can help Iran achieve an economic breakthrough. He said, we will not wait for the West to decide for our country. So this is one difference between more nationalist leaders like Raisi and the reformists, like, for instance, Hassan Rouhani, who was the president before him. Rouhani had tried to improve relations with the West in order to remove the illegal Western sanctions, the illegal unilateral sanctions that the US had imposed on Iran. That's why Rouhani signed the Iran nuclear deal, which was incorporated into international law. And then Donald Trump came to power and he unilaterally tore up the Iran nuclear deal in violation of international law. And it showed for many more nationalist politicians in Iran that it's a waste of time trying to beg the West to lift sanctions. Instead, they argue that Iran should integrate more with the global South, the global majority, and try to find economic alternatives instead of waiting and waiting and waiting for something that will never happen, which is the West supposedly ending its aggression against them. We could especially see this in the speech that Raisi gave in South Africa in 2023 at the BRICS summit, in which Iran was officially invited to join BRICS. And in his speech, he emphasized that Iran supports de-dollarization and improving economic relations with the global South. And he said, quote, the Islamic Republic of Iran decisively supports the successful efforts of BRICS in the direction of de-dollarization of economic relations between members, as well as the use of national currencies and the strengthening of BRICS mechanisms for payment and financial settlement. He also emphasized the importance of anti-colonialism. He said that he felt obligated to respect and honor Nelson Mandela, the former South African leader who fought against apartheid. And he also, Raisi said that he honored the African heroes who stood up against colonialism. He said the Islamic Republic of Iran has been a friend of Africa for a long time, and strengthening economic cooperation with African countries has been on our agenda. Raisi said, quote, maximizing interaction and strengthening multilateral cooperation mechanisms, especially with developing independent countries, is at the center of the foreign policy of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And he added, I would like to point out that one of the challenges in the southern world, that is the global south, is the continuation of racist policies, insecurities arising from oppression, occupation, hegemony, and state terrorism, especially from the Zionist regime, which not only prevented the Palestinian people from exercising their right to self-determination, but also deprived them of the right to development. So here, once again, we see that this is a narrative, this is a discourse among many other global south countries that they have in common. Despite political differences, despite cultural differences, many countries in the global south strongly identify with Iran in this common struggle against imperialism. This also explains why Raisi was a big supporter of de-dollarization and had really emphasized using local currencies in Iran's trade with other countries in order to get around the illegal US sanctions. And he made this clear in a speech that he gave after Iran joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in 2023. And Raisi called for a swift transition to settlements in national currencies between nations and for eschewing the US dollar in bilateral trade. He said, quote, "The hegemony of the Western world contributes to the hegemony of the dollar. In order to create a new economic order, it is necessary to remove this instrument of hegemony in world practice, to use national currencies in settlements between countries." Now, for people who don't know, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is one of the biggest multilateral organizations on Earth, although it's not really that well known in the West. It began as a security cooperation organization, but has now also become economic, and really it's a way to integrate Eurasia. It includes the most populous countries on Earth, China and India, also other huge countries like Russia and Pakistan, numerous Central Asian countries, and Iran under President Raisi officially became a full member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And now there are other countries in West Asia and North Africa that are dialogue partners and are interested in joining, including Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and even potentially Turkey or Turkiye. Likewise, Belarus and Mongolia are observer countries which could potentially become members in the future as well. And in this vein, one of Raisi's most important foreign policy strategies was referred to as his Look East policy, which prioritized integration with other parts of Asia. And of course, the so-called Middle East, where Iran is actually just West Asia. And this is something that the Iranian government has really emphasized. They don't use the word Middle East often. They instead use the word West Asia, emphasizing that their other partners and neighbors in the region are in Central, South, and East Asia. Now, one of the clearest examples of this is how Raisi had prioritized Iran's growing friendship with China. And in fact, under Raisi, Iran signed a historic 25-year agreement with China. And in this agreement, China agreed to provide infrastructure assistance to help modernize infrastructure in Iran. And in return, Iran would pay China not with dollars, not with currency, but rather a barter system. Iran would give China oil. So this is an example of what China refers to as win-win cooperation, mutually beneficial cooperation. And we saw examples of this like in 2023 when they announced that Iran would be paying for oil in return for China helping to develop and modernize an international airport in Iran. Of course, China is the world's leader in infrastructure, and Iran is part of the Belt and Road Initiative. And we saw an example of how close Iran and China have gotten back in 2023 when President Raisi met with China's President Xi Jinping. And in this meeting, they published a readout. This is from the Chinese embassy. And it noted that, quote, China is ready to work with Iran to strengthen cooperation on multilateral platforms, including BRICS, and push for sound and resilient development of multilateralism. And Xi Jinping said that he is glad with joint efforts of China, Iran and Saudi Arabia have achieved reconciliation, bringing greater security and stability to the Middle East. This is another very important thing that China did, which also set the stage for inviting Iran to join BRICS, and because Saudi Arabia was also invited to join BRICS at the same time. So we see an example of how Iran, which had a lot of political differences with Saudi Arabia, put them aside in order to try to bring about more global South unity so they can focus on the primary enemy, which is US-led Western imperialism. Now, also in 2013, Raisi visited Beijing and he met again with President Xi. So they met together 2 times in 1 year, showing how deep this relationship has become. And in the readout that was published by China's foreign ministry, it noted that, quote, China will remain steadfast in developing friendly cooperation with Iran and advancing China-Iran comprehensive strategic partnership and play a positive role for world peace and human progress amidst major changes unseen in a century. This is a very important quote that President Xi often repeats, that the world is seeing changes unseen in a century. And what they're really talking about is the creation of a new multipolar world that is no longer dominated by the Western imperial powers, in which there is a true international democratic system, not a global dictatorship controlled by the US, in which the global South actually has a voice. And in that vein, President Xi emphasized that China supports Iran in safeguarding its sovereignty, independence, territorial integrity, and national dignity. China supports Iran in resisting unilateralism and bullying. China opposes external forces interfering in Iran's internal affairs and undermining its security and stability. Here we see very clearly that China is referencing US aggression against Iran, US sanctions against Iran, Israel's constant attacks and killing Iranian officials. Israel has assassinated numerous Iranian officials. And here we can see that China, in its own diplomatic language, this is as straightforward as Chinese diplomatic language gets, which is always, it's very cautious. But here they're saying very clearly that China is condemning US-led imperialism and its illegal aggression against Iran. And China also emphasized that Iran is part of the Belt and Road Initiative and collaborating with China. Now, for his part in this meeting, Raisi emphasized that, quote, Iran firmly supports and will actively participate in the Belt and Road Initiative and also in other Chinese-led initiatives like the Global Development Initiative and the Global Security Initiative. He said that Iran and China are both resolutely opposed to unilateralism, hegemonism, and bullying, and resolutely opposed to foreign interference in their internal affairs. So here, once again, we can see this commonality. And while Raisi was strengthening Iran's relations with China, he was also improving relations with Russia. Of course, both Russia and China are part of BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and now Iran is also part of these organizations. And in 2022, President Raisi went to Moscow and met with President Putin. And there, Raisi emphasized the importance of, quote, strengthening bilateral cooperation between Iran and Russia to boost the economies of the two countries. He called for cooperation of economic development in the region, and Raisi condemned NATO. And the Iranian leader said that, quote, NATO influence under any kind of cover in the Caucasus and Central Asia threatens the common interests of independent countries. Raisi then met Putin a second time in 2022 in a meeting in Turkmenistan. And in this meeting, they emphasized the importance of de-dollarization. President Raisi said that there should be necessary mechanisms to strengthen the banking and monetary relations between Iran and Russia. And he said that the financial exchanges between the two countries should be in a framework that is independent of the Western financial system so that no country can infiltrate it and put pressure on it. And there clearly he's referring to the United States and also referring to the SWIFT interbank messaging system, which is dominated by the US. And the US used SWIFT to try to cut off Russian and Iranian banks. So while Raisi was president, the central banks of Iran and Russia also signed an agreement to try to unify their payment mechanisms. And of course, this issue of de-dollarization was very important for Raisi. In 2023, he visited Indonesia, the world's most populous Muslim-majority country, also a fast-growing economy, a very important country. And Iran and Indonesia deepened their relations, and they signed an agreement to drop the use of the US dollar in their bilateral trade. President Raisi emphasized that now the Iranian side would be using their currency, the rial, and the Indonesian side would use the rupiah, their currency, in order to replace the US dollar in their bilateral trade. So those are examples of how Iran was deepening its alliance with other countries in Asia and Russia, which, is part of Eurasia. And now what we also see is that under President Raisi, Iran has been heavily emphasizing its partnership with Africa and deepening its alliance. And in 2023, President Raisi met with the foreign minister of Burkina Faso. And the current government in Burkina Faso is a revolutionary anti-colonialist government led by the young revolutionary leader Ibrahim Traoré, who kicked out the French military occupiers and has really been trying to bring back the legacy of the former leftist anti-imperialist leader Thomas Sankara. And as part of this, Burkina Faso has been deepening its relations with Iran, China, Russia, and leftist governments in Latin America. And in this meeting in 2023 between President Raisi and Burkina Faso's foreign minister, Raisi praised the peoples of Africa for standing up against colonialism and terrorism, and he called to improve relations and expand cooperation with Africa. This was in the diplomatic statement that was published by the Iranian president's office, and that was titled "Resistance of African Countries Against Colonialism, a Sign of Their Awakening." So you see, again, this narrative that's so important of commonality, of a common struggle in the fight against colonialism. After that meeting, then in January of 2024, Raisi met with the new ambassador of Burkina Faso to Iran. And in that meeting, Raisi emphasized, he said, quote, "Countries like the United States and some Western governments and the Zionist regime, which claim the most to fight terrorism, are the main source of terror and terrorist groups." And he emphasized that today we witness the crimes and acts of official and state terrorism of the Zionist regime with the support of the Americans and some Western countries. So emphasizing the hypocrisy of the Western colonial powers, which claim to support human rights and claim to oppose terrorism while they're supporting Israel's state terrorism and crimes against humanity against the Palestinian people. Also, at the meeting of the BRICS in 2023, Raisi emphasized that Africa is the main driver of the development of the global South, and he added that, quote, "Fortunately, the political and economic weight of Africa, which is an inseparable part of the developing world, is growing constantly." So I already talked about how Iran has been deepening its relations with Africa and Asia, and of course there's also Latin America, and Raisi really put a big emphasis on Iran's partnership with Latin America. In 2023, he met with the president of Brazil, Lula da Silva, who also was one of the co-founders of the BRICS system. And Iran and Brazil both emphasized that they would increase their bilateral trade. And also in 2023, Raisi took a historic trip to 3 countries in Latin America: Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. These are the 3 countries in Latin America that have socialist governments, revolutionary, anti-imperialist governments, and they're also the governments that the US has demonized as the so-called troika of tyranny. The US has imposed sanctions on them, has tried to violently overthrow their governments, backing coup attempts, and Iran's President Raisi visited these 3 countries, which was a clear sign of defiance against US imperialism and unity of the global South. In June of 2023, Raisi visited Cuba, and he met with Cuba's revolutionary president, Miguel Díaz-Canel. And then in December, Cuba's President Diaz-Canel visited Iran and had a meeting. So it showed once again how deep these relations are. 2 meetings in just a few months. And in this meeting, President Raisi emphasized how since the Iranian Revolution, Iran has deepened its alliance with Cuba. And he noted that the 2 countries have had good cooperation in the field of science and technology. In fact, Cuba and Iran worked together to develop a vaccine. They collaborated on a vaccine. Furthermore, Raisi emphasized that, quote, one of the serious commonalities between Iran and Cuba is standing against the veracity of the colonial system. And he said, Cuba has been standing against American hegemony and veracity for many years, and this resistance of the Cuban people and government is commendable. And Raisi said, quote, the idea of the Americans and the hegemony system, which is imperialism he's talking about, is that the imposition of sanctions can stop our countries or force us to surrender. This is the negligence of the domination system and a miscalculation, like all the other miscalculations by they who think that by imposing sanctions, they can force nations that decided to stand up against the veracity of the domination system to back down. And Raisi emphasized that it is so unfortunate what is being done by the Zionist regime and the support of America and the West for these horrible crimes. He said, how do those who claim to support human rights support these crimes against humanity? He said also what is even more unfortunate than these crimes and the Westerners' support for it is the inefficiency of the international system, which could not stop the war machine that the Americans provided to the Zionist regime. He noted that the United Nations, the Security Council, the Arab League, and many human rights unions and organizations have lost their effectiveness. Today, humanity is witnessing the ineffectiveness of international organizations that claim to defend the oppressed. And Raisi said that in negotiations with the respected president of Cuba, Iran and Cuba reached the point that this unjust world system must end, and we must seek to form a just world system in the light of which we can defend the oppressed. And this narrative of Iran unifying with Latin America against imperialism and oppression was also repeated when Raisi in June also visited Venezuela and he met with President Nicolás Maduro. In that meeting in Caracas, Raisi pledged to deepen Iran's trade with Venezuela. And I'm reading here from the minutes from Iran's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It notes that Ayatollah Sayyid Ebrahim Raisi praised the years of resistance of the Venezuelan people against imperialism. So again, this is the official readout from Iran's foreign ministry, using this important rhetoric of imperialism and colonialism, not just hegemony, not just oppression, but a system of imperialism, and Iran is unified with the Latin American left against imperialism. Despite political differences and ideological differences that they might have, they are allies in the struggle against imperialism. He also added that, quote, the people of Iran and Venezuela have common enemies who do not want us to live independently. And this important point of anti-imperialist unity was also emphasized when President Raisi visited Nicaragua in June, and he met with Nicaraguan President Daniel Ortega and Vice President Rosario Murillo. The friendship between Iran and Nicaragua has become very strong, and in fact, every single year, both countries celebrate the anniversary of the revolution, which happened in 1979 in February in Iran, and on the 19th of July in Nicaragua, when the Sandinistas overthrew a US-backed brutal right-wing dictatorship. So there are so many parallels there. And in fact, Nicaragua and Iran refer to their revolutions as brotherly revolutions or sisterly revolutions. In Spanish, it's revolución hermana, which means sisterly revolution because it's a feminine word. The point is that they emphasize the commonality of their unified struggle, and they also both overthrew US-backed dictators, the Shah in Iran, the Somoza dictatorship in Nicaragua. And you can see how close the Iranian-Nicaraguan partnership has become if you look at the speech that Raisi and Ortega gave when they met in Managua. And Raisi called Westerners' claims of democracy and human rights false. And he said, quote, "Westerners, especially Americans, should respect the systems that emerge from people's votes, but they are doing the opposite." So he's calling out the hypocrisy of the Western imperial powers who claim to be democracies, but actually oppose elected independent governments in the global South, trying to overthrow them. And Raisi said, quote, "America wanted to stop our nation with sanctions and threats, but our nation not only did not stop, but instead it used the threats and sanctions to build and progress." And President Ortega, the revolutionary leader of the Sandinista front in Nicaragua, he emphasized that, quote, "The revolutions of the two countries had strong roots in fighting domination, especially by the United States, which has always sought to impose its will on others." And President Ortega of Nicaragua described hegemony as part of the nature of imperialism. Again, this importance of the struggle against imperialism. That was not the only time that the Nicaraguan and Iranian presidents talked in 2023. Also in December, they had a phone call. And in that phone call, Raisi told President Ortega, quote, "We are certain that Nicaragua too can overcome the US's threats and sanctions, since today the US is in decline and is growing weaker day by day." And Raisi emphasized that the international hegemonic system cannot impose its will on the Islamic Republic and Nicaragua, since the countries rely on their people's votes and support, and can therefore stand up to the hegemonic powers' excessive demands. And President Ortega expressed confidence that the countries would be capable of standing together in the face of imperialism and tread successfully down the course of advancement. And also in 2021, when President Raisi had his inauguration, Nicaragua's foreign minister, Denis Moncada, was actually present. He went to Tehran to attend President Raisi's inauguration, and then they met together. And in that meeting, President Raisi emphasized that, quote, "Resisting the unjust greed of the United States has made Nicaragua a model for Latin American countries and movements resisting arrogance and hegemony in the region." He emphasized that the Iranian people have always wished success and victory to the revolutionary nation of Nicaragua. And for his part, the foreign minister of Nicaragua, Denis Moncada, said that, quote, "Nicaragua will continue the path toward the realization of the goals of its revolution with the help of friendly countries like the Islamic Republic of Iran. It will protect the common ideals of revolutionary countries, especially the goal of fighting arrogance," which is a translation they're using for hegemony, fighting hegemony. So again, I've really emphasized this point a lot here, but I really just wanted to highlight looking at official statements from the government of Iran and other governments, China, Russia, in Africa and Latin America, showing how under President Raisi, Iran has deepened its relations with the global South, fought against Western imperialism and neocolonialism, called for de-dollarization, strengthened multilateralism and multipolarity in the world. President Raisi was a major force pushing for more multipolarity, opposing Western hegemony. And his tragic death is not only a loss for the people of Iran, it's also a loss for the people of the global South, who represent the majority of the world population. They are the global majority. And we will see what happens going forward in Iran, but I think regardless of who the future leaders will be, we will see this continuity of Iran deepening its relations with the global South and recognizing that the West is not the future. The Western hegemony is the past. The global South represents the global majority, and they represent the future of humanity. On that note, I'm going to conclude here. I'm Ben Norton. I am the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. Please like and subscribe. Please share. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. I will see you next time.